In this video, Ginger and Smudge visit. I see how close I can get to the feeding birds. Ginger comes in daylight, and the pigeon tackles the bird feeder. Hello and welcome back to What's in the Wood in January. This is weeks 3 and 4. It's been quite busy with birds from weeks 1 and 2, but nighttime visitors has been a little bit quieter, possibly because of the cold and the stormy weather that we've been having. So we'll go straight into week 3 now. Ginger and Smudge were the first visitors to start the third week in January at 5 to 6 in the morning. Ginger was back on his own an hour later. A dove and robin were the first daylight visitors. The dove was throwing its weight around again, chasing a blackbird. A coal tit dropped in at 9:12, but they never stopped for long. A blue tit came to the feeder not long after, followed by a pair of great tits. At 12:23, a chaffinch was spotted by the thorny olive tree. This bird has become a more frequent visitor over the last month. Early that afternoon, I tried to see how close I could get to the birds and sat with my phone around 4 feet from the seed pile. After the blackbird and robin, it went quiet, so I moved away, but still caught a blue tit and a coal tit. Late afternoon, as the light was fading, but while the camera was still in daylight mode, it caught a colour video of Ginger. 4:20 was a very early visit for one of the foxes. Speedy the mouse and Bandit the cat were the last visitors of the 15th. It was a bit misty when Jerry Mouse became the first visitor of the 16th, while Speedy watched from under the thorny olive tree. An hour later, the two mice were by the pond. They made multiple visits throughout the night. It was misty and -2 degrees when the two magpies came in the morning. An hour later it had cleared to a bright but overcast sky. There weren't many captures that morning. Early afternoon, I did spot the magpie on the lawn, the one with the limp. I really need a name for him. I think this was a bluetit. The visit was so fast, even looking at each video frame, it was hard to tell if it was a bluetit or great tit. The chaffinch was back late afternoon, along with a robin and dove. They were joined by a blackbird and dunnock. Speedy was out at 1:20 in the morning to start the action for the 17th. Five hours later it was two mice. I'm guessing Speedy and Jerry, as they both cleared off in different directions. At dawn it was the two magpies who started the captures. One has a limp, so I'm calling him Davy Jones, and the other one is Barbosa. Daytime captures increased later in January, with a total of 345 captures over the last 2 weeks. That equates to 5¾ hours of video. As a result, I've had to seriously thin out the clips that I've added here. Tips the cat was the last visitor of the 17th. Here's a mouse just visible. The beginning of the year has seen a lot of rain, and this has resulted in many captures with the camera lens being misted over. An hour later, and the camera had cleared. By 7:30 in the morning, the lens had misted up again, with only one mouse visible. An hour and a half later, the camera was still misted as a blackbird searched the woodland floor. The heat from the infrared LEDs and the electronics in the camera will defrost the lens if there's multiple captures consecutively. The camera had switched to infrared mode by 4:15 when one of the doves came to the seed pile. A couple of minutes later, the sky must have brightened slightly, allowing a color image in starlight mode. Ginger came to check out what food was around at 6:42, and he hung around for around 10 minutes. Jerry and Speedy were the last action for the 18th. Danger Mouse was out at 1:25 on the 19th. He seems a lot more cautious than the other mice. An hour later, Smudge came to the wood for a brief visit. After another hour, at 3:34, one of the mice was back. It headed to the mouse house, so I'm guessing it was Speedy or Danger Mouse. Another 2.5 hours later was another mouse, the last capture of the night. There was less activity at dawn, starting with the magpies, followed by doves and robins, but otherwise quiet. The camera switched on again at 3:30, but only caught a blackbird at 4 p.m. At 10 to 5, the light hadn't fully faded when a mouse triggered the camera with a robin nearby. There was no other activity until Ginger showed up just after 9 p.m. The camera lens was misted over for the first few captures. After 10 consecutive videos, the LEDs and electronics heat had cleared the camera lens, and the temperature rose from 5 to 25 degrees. Ginger finished the captures for the 19th. The night was quiet until Danger Mouse appeared at 5:30. Two hours later, it was the turn of Speedy to visit the seed pile. That was it until morning. The magpie Davy Jones was the first visit on the morning of the 20th, still protecting an injured left foot. Just before 10, I got a blackbird on my phone, and the Trailcam got a colted visiting at 10:30. The rest of the morning saw the other magpie, doves, robins, Bluetits, until the camera switched off at 11:30. The dove was back at 4:30, and as the light was fading, the blackbird came for a dip in the pond. The evening was quiet until Smudge came at 9:14, but she was the last visitor for the 20th. Overnight was quiet until 5:40, when Speedy and Danger appeared. Bandit made a brief appearance at 7:25. Around 20 seconds later, Danger Mouse popped out of the burrow to check what was happening. The wet weather limited the bird activity that morning, with just a single magpie and a dove starting the day, not much after. Great tits and cool tits on the feeder ended the daylight activity for the 21st. At 9:30 that evening, Ginger was in the wood, and his nose caught the smell of the bird feeder. I don't know why this night was different, but he seemed mesmerized by the smell, almost as if he was getting high from it. He was sniffing the bird feeder for almost a full minute. Bandit made a brief pass through the wood at 11:38, stopping briefly near the mouse burrow, ending activity for the 21st. On the 22nd, there were no captures until dawn, when one of the magpies came to the feeder. Doves, great tits and blue tits filled the morning captures. Robins, dunnocks and doves ended the captures for the day. There were no nighttime captures on the 22nd. Speedy started the 23rd with a quick dash into the darkness up the wood and was the only overnight capture. The dawn visits were magpies, doves, robins and coal-tits. The afternoon activity was similar, but with the dove throwing its weight around again. The evening was quiet until Bandit turned up and sat down for a while behind the wild privet. Almost an hour later, Ginger passed up the wood before coming back and leaving onto the lawn. There were no overnight captures on the morning of the 24th, with the magpie at dawn being the first activity. The usual morning birds were there, often waiting close by, waiting for me to download the camera and bring more seed out. The pigeons and doves are too big to hang on the feeder and usually feed from the ground. However, on this morning, one of the doves gave the feeder a go, with much wing flapping to try and stay in position. Mid-afternoon, while doing some video editing in the lounge, I noticed what initially I thought were dogs on the hill over the road. A closer look showed them to be two foxes. They are probably our garden foxes, as the camera often spots them heading up the garden in that direction. I grabbed my DSLR camera with the 70-300mm zoom lens and caught a few pictures. A measure later on Google Earth put them around 600 feet away from where I was. Looking at the leg markings, I think the last picture shows Ginger, and he appears to have something in his mouth. A blackbird and a great tit ended the captures for the 24th. There were no overnight captures, and the first activity was in the pre-dawn light with a blackbird, robin and dunnock. It was a stormy day, and I think that kept the birds away for most of the day. The magpie and dove were back at 3 p.m. Various smaller birds arrived late in the afternoon. Danger Mouse was caught making a quick dash to the burrow at 11:35, and there was no other activity before midnight. Speedy was seen grabbing a big lump of something, possibly a peanut, around 3:30 in the morning. Almost 2 hours later, Latte the ginger cat passed up the wood. The blackbird and robin were out in the pre-dawn light at 10 to 8, and 40 minutes later, the camera was in colour starlight mode. At 8:45, the pigeon was getting defensive over the seed pile, while the magpie was trying to feed. The wind speed was quite low on the 26th, so there was a lot more bird visits across the day. 10 to 4 in the afternoon, a number of long-tailed tits arrived on the feeder. They aren't seen very often in the garden, but I have seen up to 8 together when they are caught on camera. That was it for the afternoon and early evening, until Jerry turned up just after 11 p.m. I'm saying Jerry as he exited camera left rather than returning to the burrow on the right. It was 3:23 before there was any action on the 27th, with Ginger seen by the pond. The dove chased off a chaffinch at 8:30, but it was back by the pond a few minutes later. The wind had also picked up once again. The wind caused quite a few balance issues for the small birds in the feeder. I think that also kept many birds away, as there were no more captures after 8:42 in the morning. Smudge began the day on the 28th, just before 1 a.m. This was followed by another visit around an hour later. Just after 8 a.m, what looked like a redwing fell out of a tree, landing near the pond. Stunned for a moment, it hopped under the juniper bush and seemed okay. A blackbird by the pond and a bluetit on the feeder were out over lunchtime. It went quiet until just after 3 p.m, when a chaffinch was spotted. Blue and great tits were swarming the feeder, while the dove and robin waited below for spilled seed. The chaffinch was still around at 3:25 and was joined by a dunnock, both searching the woodland floor below the feeder. A coal tit ended the day at the early time of 4:13 in the afternoon. Ginger was the first visitor of the 29th, being caught in 9 captures from 1:15 to 1:30. He did a fairly good job of clearing the seed piles on the stepping stones. Speedy and Danger were out at 2:37, with Danger Mouse seen dropping into the burrow. At 3:15, it was Jerry and Danger who were out. Danger Mouse stayed close to the burrow entrance. That was it until dawn, when Davy Jones, Barbosa, and the pigeons were out. A blackbird and a bluetit were seen a little later. Just before 9 a.m, it was a great tit at the feeder, with a blackbird and robin by the pond. I was topping up the seed at 10 a.m. and caught a blackbird on my phone. He's quite timid, so I'm surprised he got so close. I stayed out in the cold for a few minutes and got a dunnock from the other side of the pond too. There was nothing else until late afternoon, when a blackbird and a robin returned, and they were the last visitors of the 29th. Ginger was the first action for the 30th, arriving at 1:38 and staying a few minutes before leaving up the wood. Jerry was seen at 10 to 4, leaving heading down the wood. Speedy ended the nighttime captures at 20 to 7. As frequently happens, the magpies began the daytime captures at 8 a.m. The blackbird, robin and coaltit were also there within half an hour. The camera switched off at 9 a.m. and back on again at 12:30 to 1:15, making just one capture. Ginger was the only nighttime capture at 9:20. Nothing was caught between Ginger's visit the previous evening until just before 1 p.m. on the afternoon of the 31st. By 1:07, limping Davy Jones and a pigeon were by the pond. It went quiet again until late afternoon, then nothing until Bandit came in the early evening. Bandit stayed in the wood for around 15 minutes and left heading up the wood. He wasn't gone long before returning heading back down the wood, stopping briefly by the thorny olive tree. He was the last catch of January. Thanks for watching. Do consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.